Hi friends, I hope you're well. In this last video in this series of videos of instructed Eucharists, I thought it might be nice to just focus on the altar and the items that we have up here and what happens during the blessing of communion, during the Holy Eucharist. And I'd like to start out in the prayer book, and you might know that in the prayer book, when the priest prays the Eucharistic Prayer, which is the prayer over the bread and wine to bless it for our use and to invoke God's presence in the bread and the wine and make it the body and blood, there's a prayer called the Proper Preface that the priest says that is not in your prayer book. And so after the priest says it is right and a good and joyful thing always and everywhere to give thanks to you, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, you may notice that in the rubrics, in the italicized verses here, it says, a proper preface is sung or said on all Sundays. And the proper prefaces are found on page 377, and that's a prayer that we say that reflects the liturgical year. So there are prayers that we might say in ordinary time, prayers for Advent, prayers for Lent and Easter, but that's where those prayers are. And then when you turn the page, after I say that prayer, we continue. Therefore we praise you, joining our voices with angels and archangels. And in the Eucharist, the congregation is using the prayer book, and the priest up here at the altar has something called the altar book. And the altar book is like the prayer book, but it's just it's formatted a little bit differently so that the celebrant or the priest celebrating communion has bigger type, and it's organized in a way that's better for the celebration of the Eucharist at the altar. So the priest uses this book, and then there are page numbers that I can tell you about where to find the prayers in the prayer book. The other things up here at the altar are the stack, and underneath this is the chalice. So if we lift up this veil, you'll see underneath it, the thing at the bottom is the chalice, and then the purificator, which is like a napkin that we might use in our meal, is placed over that. And then the paten, or the plate, and the plate is what holds all the bread during the Eucharist, and the chalice holds the wine. And then there's a pall that goes over that, and then the veil, and then the burse. And in the burse, there are extra purificators in case we need them during the distribution of communion. And this just makes a very elegant display of basically the things that we use during the meal, during our dinner for the dinner that we call the Eucharist. And there's something really interesting about some of these things. This pall it's a nice piece of square cardboard that has linen over it, and it keeps the shape when the stack is on top of the chalice. But when we take it off, it can also be used if we're outside to keep bugs out of the chalice. And historically, that was very useful in a time when we would have been outside, or in the early church when there were lots of bugs. We sometimes have things that have theological significance, and this has a very practical significance for keeping anything that we don't want out of the wine or the blood of Christ. So once we distribute communion and say the prayer, then we put everything back on top of the chalice and redo the stack, putting the pall back on top of that, and the veil on top of that, and then the burse on top of that. So if you've ever wondered what is underneath here, because sometimes we use the high altar and we really can't see too closely what's under here, those are the items under the stack. And then at the credence table, you'll see the acolyte hand the priest the bread box called the ciborium, and then the flagons or the pitchers of wine and water. And when we pour the wine and water into the chalice, that is symbolic of when Jesus was pierced in the side at the crucifixion, water also came out, blood and water. So the wine is a symbol of the blood of Christ, as we know, and then the water we place in the chalice to remember that that is what mixed with his blood at his death. So I hope that this helps illuminate a little bit of what happens up here at the altar with the stack and the altar book and the Proper Preface. And in the future, we'll do some more of these videos to help illuminate the details of the Eucharist. But for now, I hope this has been an educational series of videos for you, and I hope that you are well, and I will see you in church.